Welcome everybody to SIG Architecture. It is Thursday, October 18th, 2018. I am your SIG Architecture chair, co-chair, Jay Singer-Dumars, and I am at Google HQ here in San Francisco. Go ahead and get kicked off on the agenda, which is available after the fact if you want to follow along at http://bit.ly/sig-architecture. And it's also in the chat window. So we're going to start off with Andrew to talk about cloud provider dependencies. And it looks like there's a little bit of back and forth in the chat on the agenda on this. So let's go ahead and reconcile those comments as we have this discussion and try and time docs this in about 10 minutes, if that works.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah, to provide some background first, as many of you know, we are trying to remove all the cloud providers from in-tree Kubernetes, which is just Kubernetes/Kubernetes. And there's a lot of benefits by doing that, and I don't want to go too much into all that, but it's going to kind of break off the dependencies we have from the main Kubernetes release and allow cloud providers to kind of work independently from that. And also, just want to plug in that Walter from Google did a quick test, I think a few weeks ago, and he found that by removing all the cloud provider dependencies, he was able to chop off about 30 megabytes on all the kind of master libraries or master component binaries. And so pretty much why I wanted to talk about it in this meeting is that we have kind of a three-phase approach for this, which is first to move all the provider code into Kubernetes staging. And the point of this is that we can then sync all the providers into their respective external repos, while also being able to build all the in-tree, Kube Controller Manager, Kube API Server, Kubelet with all the provider libraries at the same time. And so we're trying to kind of do this in-tree, out-of-tree in a smooth transition because we don't want to break anyone's production cluster, right? And so part of doing that staging part requires us not to depend on any of the internal libraries in Kubernetes/Kubernetes. And we're finding that there are a lot of dependencies in there. And pretty much what we've been kind of doing so far is listing out all the dependencies and trying to figure out like where can we dump these generic utils, libraries, and all that in a place that's not Kubernetes/Kubernetes, but also in a clean way that everyone kind of agrees is okay going forward. So right now we've been kind of just dumping things on Kubernetes/utils, and pretty much what I'm asking is like, are we okay with that going forward, or is there alternatives that we haven't thought of yet?
Hey, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Cool, this is Tim. So I've already reviewed 3 or 4 of those PRs, and those ones seemed okay. In general, we tried to keep utils pretty generic. NSEnter, I think, was sort of on the border there. I could sort of have made an argument that it should be its own repo because it's really sort of a useful library on its own. But I don't know if it's worth the energy to go through that. So I'm fine to keep approving PRs against utils, knowing that I reserve the right to question APIs that move into utils. It's sort of a promotion in scope, and so everything that moves in there gets sort of another look at it, both the doc comments and the test cases and the APIs overall. But I'm happy with that overall. We should also be open to moving things into new top-level repos if that is appropriate. I have no problems with it. It's just a little bit of work to do it. Yeah. And honestly, if somebody wanted to chase down NSEnter and move it to a top-level repo, I would be okay with that.
Yeah, I think in terms of user experience, a new top-level repo is better user experience, like Go language developer being user. Targeted repos with strict compatibility guarantees are the best user experience. For things that are like one file with 3 functions, then maybe a home utils is all that's warranted. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of the things we're looking at here, I don't think we're signing up for really publicly maintaining an API with strong version compatibility and stuff.
Can I challenge that? Like, should we be putting stuff in repos if we're not going to sign up for that? And like, as someone who's writing Go code and importing things and using them and gluing them together and trying to make something that operates and keep it operating, it's a huge pain when libraries break compatibility.
Yeah, I sort of object to the de facto Go assumption that all libraries are valid for import. And I know it's part of the Go ecosystem, so I can't really fight that, but I don't think that you should be peeking under my covers unless I tell you you can. I think Go's got it ass backwards, but that is what we've got.
But maybe more generally, to push some of this functionality that's currently in tree out of tree. This is a pattern that we should establish.
Yes.
And that the trend that we want to support is moving those shared dependencies out of Kubernetes, where it belongs in the junk in the trunk utils repo. We should do that.
We're renaming it to junk in the
trunk. Yeah. Every utils directory or library is a junk in the trunk.
Well, I prefer kitchen sink.
But where it makes sense and it might be useful beyond just the Kubernetes project, maybe that deserves more scrutiny.
I guess that's the distinction I was making.
That's the distinction.
NSEnter in particular, I know that other cloud providers are going to need it, so we should not actively break it, but I don't think we're signing up for it to be listed on like Awesome Go or anything.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think the things we're talking about, we should, specifically what we're doing is taking them out from, as you put it, under the covers and making it public. So we should be asking that question of, is this something that we want as relatively public and that we want to support? Like, if we don't want to do it, then we should be questioning whether we should be allowing this move out.
It's fair.
So I'm going to argue with you, Tim, a little bit here, because I think you're imagining there's 3 levels. There's like a KK dependency, there's a Kubernetes ecosystem dependency, and then there's like Awesome Go, right? And I would actually argue that like that middle one doesn't exist. Like it's either, in a /internal directory in KK or the moral equivalent, or it's an Awesome Go, and there's really not much in between.
I understand that. I sort of still want there to be a second level, but I acknowledge that as I think about it out loud, I guess it is hard to sort of enforce that, especially as we cast the net wider and wider for things being out of tree. So fine.
I mean, we're in that position with Client Go, right?
Yeah, I mean, things like I'm just going to pick on NSEnter for a minute, right? Because it was written in a way that was, well, let's just say it's not the best library I've ever seen. But it's expedient and it does what it needs to do, but it's not like, I don't think anybody's put a lot of design thought into what the awesomest UX around NSEnter would be. It has a purpose and it fits that purpose and not much else. And if we're okay with that, I guess that's fine. We are not versioning Kubernetes utils right now. Like we don't have any sort of semantic versioning attached to it.
Okay,
so
that's a bigger
real
conversation.
quick, so Matt's got his hand up and we got a time box of about 10 minutes. So we've got a couple minutes to run through this. So,
okay, so just so I have an actionable item on my end, it seems like we're okay, keep going with kutils. And if we try to add something in kutils that we feel like should be breaking into its own repo, then it can be proposed in that PR, and then we can kind of keep doing work to break things out where it makes sense. One thing that we are blocked on is we don't have someone who is a top-level approver that is a kind of a single point of contact for this project. So it'd be great if we can have someone assigned for that here.
But you got me. There's not that many approvers for utils, so.
Yeah, I've been seeing those emails too, but Tim is.
Okay, so we just kind of throw all those PRs at Tim then going forward.
Yeah,
Thanks.
you can tag me on all of them, and if you find me to be delinquent, you feel free to give me a hard time.
Okay.
I'm happy to approve small stuff, but I don't feel like I have the context to sort of do new things. But if you have like small changes you need to make in there that are not sort of API stuff, I can help facilitate those.
And in truth, most of these changes are taking code from one place and moving it to another place, and then any deltas we apply are on top of that.
Yeah.
okay, so Matt had a question and then Aaron has a question, and let's try and keep it to under a couple minutes.
Okay, so I'll be quick as I can be. I think we need to start thinking more about with our stuff how the external tools do it, because I do agree with Joe that there isn't that middle layer. And by not really thinking about what it's like to be on Awesome Go, we're trying to move fast. And I know some folks have said, well, I'm moving too fast to document anything. I'm moving too fast to stick with my architecture, but we're trying to slow things down. And we really want to enable this ecosystem out there. And quite frankly, there's a lot of work being done, and they're very annoyed with the way we're handling things. And so if we want to slow down, maybe it's time to have some real conversations about how we get there and what we should do. And we don't have to do it today, but I think it's a worthy agenda item for us to talk about how do we get to a saner place for that ecosystem, because it's already there and it's annoyed with us, and they don't necessarily have easy to work with alternatives, or they're creating them and we don't even want them to. So we've got to go figure out what we're going to do here. But
Okay, Matt, you just signed up for an AI. Put your item in the agenda for next week, and let's talk about it. Aaron.
I was just going to ask, Tim, who would you want to grow as an additional approver in the utils repo?
I don't want to volunteer anybody. This is not that hard of a job. It just requires API sort of taste, but not like Kubernetes API, but like Go APIs.
Who else here would like to help Tim out?
So moving stuff.
There's no limit. It can be 100 people.
Yes.
All right, David.
I'm happy to
So was the question about putting stuff into KTIO util or top level approver in the kube tree to actually be able to pull it out afterward?
Both for
Right. And so top level approvers in the kube tree aren't likely to grow significantly. And yeah. So
I was going to volunteer Justin, just as he volunteered. Second to Justin.
Walter also raised his hand here. It's not like we get that many reviews on this. And honestly, I'll walk back from my previous statement and say, fine, if we're treating these repos as really supported things, then yeah, let's apply some real rigor around API design and test coverage and other things. You know, maybe a longer term, medium term plan is to actually start semantically versioning these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
At Matt's point that the ecosystem is there and it's annoyed with us, as we split things into multiple repos, we will become the repo. We will become the ecosystem, and we will be annoyed with us if we extract things and then refactor them and change them in other ways. So be aware that the next person to be annoyed with your breaking change might be you.
Yeah.
That already happens on a daily basis.
We should move on.
Yeah. I was going to say, shall I move on to my part of the agenda?
Well, David has his hand up. I just want to make sure we wrap up anything there. But quickly, David.
Yeah, I guess I can get up with Tim and Andrew after and figure out where and when we would actually force a refactoring of the API. Because if we force it when it comes into the util package, it'll make the diff harder for the top level reviewer in KubeCube.
Yeah, that would be great to coordinate that. Thank you.
Yeah, let's think up on that. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, and moving along, Aaron of SIGBird, you've got the floor.
Yes, sharing screen now. So just to recap, I said I would do this last week. This is happening. I am running the proposed 113 feature set through SIG Architecture prior to feature freeze. I'm also going to do the same thing prior to code freeze, so we can all subjectively decide whether or not these things look like they are actually contributing to the reliability and stability of Kubernetes, as that is one of our proposed goals, and that is one of the goals of the release theme. I'm sure this is probably unreadable. I apologize for that. This is linked in the meeting notes if you want to follow along there. So what I've done here is just cluster up the features according to my machine learning brain, and I've added comments to the things that I think we should talk about. So back up from a high-level theme, I think that Azure is one of the sets. There's some just miscellaneous Azure improvements. There are some miscellaneous improvements to CRDs. There are a lot of features related to CSI. There is a push for this phrase CSI is going to GA, but it's unclear to me what that means. There's a push to make kubeadm go to GA. There's some miscellaneous kubectl stuff like plugins and such. There also seem to be some features or enhancements related to the interaction between kubectl and the server side. So things like server-side apply, API server dry run, server-side printing of kubectl. There are a couple of miscellaneous things that I didn't know where to place, things like dynamic audit configuration, finally deprecating etcd2, switching the core DNS as the default, and ephemeral containers, formerly known as debug containers. There are a couple miscellaneous node things like supporting node level user namespace or run as group. There's some miscellaneous scheduling things like taint-based eviction or co-scheduling or topology-aware volume scheduling. And then there is support for Windows Server containers going to GA. So that's just a high-level summary. Let's dive into a couple of the things I wanted to ask this group specifically. So for CRDs, it's kind of unclear to me whether or not there's a real push or driving force behind improving webhook conversion for custom CRDs or the CRD installation mechanism. The CRD installation mechanism seemed to be something that CSI was depending upon, but that they had some sort of workaround for. I see David has his hands up. I will defer.
Yeah, both of those things were discussed at the SIG call for API machinery last week. Mehdi is looking at the CRD webhook conversion, and Daniel asked, I think it was Saad, to come up with a proposal for the CRD installation.
Okay. My gut tells me that neither of these things would really affect or alter the core stability of Kubernetes. I think my main question was whether anybody had a sense that this could affect the stability of other features that I just mentioned. But hearing nothing real objectionable there, I will move on. So CSI going to GA. The only thing out of these 13 storage features that's listed as GA is the out-of-tree CSI plugins going to GA. There are a whole bunch of other things like inline persistent volumes, block storage support, in-tree migration to out-of-tree. Like none of that is GA or alpha, or like some of it's not even beta. So like, I guess maybe I should have gotten Saad to show up here. Could maybe somebody in Sunnyvale poke Saad to understand, or maybe somebody here already knows, like am I phrasing this incorrectly when I say CSI is going to GA?
I had seen pull requests that were looking to promote the volume attachment objects to V1. So this is persistent volume CSI only. It is not inline CSI. It is not in-tree conversion. It is not some of those other things. From what I understand, it is only promoting the APIs that CSI persistent volumes depend on.
And only for those plugins that live out of tree.
Correct.
Hi, folks. I was pinged.
Hey, Saad. Just trying to sort of ascertain, maybe from a messaging level, when we talk about CSI going GA, it seems like the only real feature issue here that's going to stable is the out-of-tree CSI plugins. It might confuse users if there was a message of CSI is going GA when it turns out like there's no support for inline volumes, that this is just persistent volumes only, and there's no clear path of migration from in-tree to out-of-tree. So
yeah, so we had a lot of discussion within the SIG about this, and what we decided was that we need to decouple the various components of CSI. CSI is a massive, massive project. So we started it Q4 of last year, at least the core of it. And what we decided was that the core feature for actually being able to create an external driver, that functionality is ready to go GA. By the time that we mark it as GA, what that means is anybody with an external, anybody that wants to write an external driver can now do so against a stable API. So the two things that you mentioned, one was inline volume support. Inline volume support is being added for two reasons. One is backwards compatibility for the migration from the in-tree drivers to the CSI drivers. So it's for backwards compatibility reasons. And then the second is for ephemeral drivers, ephemeral local drivers. So ideally, we want CSI to be able to be used long-term to replace or to write drivers similar to the drivers that we have for, say, config map volumes or empty dir volumes, things like that. So that is a longer-term goal. It's not a requirement for the initial release. For the initial release, we want remote persistent volumes. So for that reason, we're okay decoupling those two things. And I think there was a third one that you mentioned.
I think I've gotten what I need, which is, that part of this is a review to make sure we're not potentially breaking any existing functionality. It sounds like you're more moving external functionality to stable, and that we're just going to have to be careful about messaging of this from a release perspective. This isn't CSI goes GA. This is a very specific piece of a very specific section of CSI goes GA.
So CSI, the protocol is going to go to 1.0 this quarter, and the implementation on this Kubernetes side for remote persistent volumes is going to go to GA. So that means you can write remote persistent volumes against a stable API. When we do the communication, the blog post, everything, we'll have a list of things that are still pending. That'll include ephemeral volumes and talk about the migration plans for the entry volumes as well.
Okay. Thanks, Saad.
Cool.
Trying to move ahead quickly since I am time boxed here. The next one that kind of caught my eye was adding ephemeral containers. So this was formerly known as debug containers. It's been kind of around for a while. The thing that's tripping me up is this seems to be talking about changing the core API, and I wasn't sure if anybody from SIG Arch was familiar with this, had gone through an API review on this stuff. Can I?
We've reviewed this thing to death. Like
this was opened like 2 years ago, and
so just TLDR, are we happy with it?
Yes, Jordan, I think was the one of the primary voices who was arguing for changes early on. I'm satisfied. Jordan, do you continue to be satisfied?
Yeah, I was happy about 8 months ago.
Yeah, I was happy last time I saw it, but I haven't looked recently.
Great, sounds good. Moving on. Like I said, the thing that tripped me up was it sounded like changing the V1 API. That seems weird. Okay, dropping support for etcd2. I would like to call this done when we've actually gotten the entire tree of etcd out of the vendor directory. We can't do that right now because the migrator still has dependencies on that. I don't think this is at risk. I'm just giving a heads up that it might get punted to the next quarter if that doesn't happen. I wanted a sanity check from Jordan and maybe Tim Allclair, since you're here, on the run it as group feature for containers in a pod. Just since you reviewed the API, do you feel like that's looking good?
Yeah, nothing changed in pods this release. That was added last release. This release, it was adding support in pod security policy to gate that field. So it remains alpha, and it is in, and it is
cool. All right. The other question similar to that is there's a feature around co-scheduling, formerly known as gang scheduling. And most of this work is planned to happen out of tree in the Kube arbitrator project, but there is apparently some in-tree stuff that has to happen, maybe API related. Has anybody here taken a look at that or reviewed that?
The last several passes I took through it, I still didn't understand why the in-tree bits were required. I thought those got removed, but I hadn't circled back.
Okay. Jordan, can I maybe tap you to follow up on that?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Was that Jordan or David? That
was Jordan.
Okay. Sorry. My ears are not working.
That's okay. I've got the Brady Bunch mode. So just a heads up that taint-based eviction on nodes is going to beta, so that means it's flipping from being gated behind a feature flag to being turned on by default. We have concerns that this will have scalability problems. They were raised last release. That's why it didn't go to beta last release. So we're keeping a close eye on this and may ask for a revert prior to code freeze. So that's the major time box, because I wanted to get to Windows Server Containers going to GA. This has a lot of implications when it comes to conformance. And maybe I want to hand it over to Patrick Lang to just kind of walk through this, because I think you have the most context. But basically, there are a litany of tests that we need to decide whether they still make sense in the context of conformance, whether we're okay with those tests being skipped for Windows containers specifically, so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. And we also have Michael on the call, who's the other co-chair for SIG Windows. So before I talk, is volume okay? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Okay, good. All right, so basically, over the last several months, we've been working on a number of changes to support being able to run conformance tests on Windows. So some of them are as simple as, rebuilding some of the containers that are needed to work on Windows. Things like, the basic kitten web server and things like that were Go code just need to be recompiled. And then when the EDA tests go to start that container, they work. But in order to swap between OSs, we've already got a PR in that lets you pick which repositories you're going to use for those images, because right now all the ones that the EDA tests depend on are not multi-arc images. So we basically have a set of substitute ones that are there. And so for the majority of the test cases, that approach has worked just fine, and we've got tests that are, ready to be enabled, through the normal jobs. The second group of tests are ones that are covering Linux-only features. The easiest example there would be things like the SE Linux options, but then there's also things like differences in file permissions and some of the other OS-specific capabilities that are there. And so Aaron just posted the overall tracking issue I have there that lists all the individual test cases. But basically, these are ones that, because they are testing Linux-specific functionality, there's not really a way to make them run as is for Windows. And so, at a high level, we basically need some way to either skip or decide that we want to have conformance tests that fork and have OS and do intentionally test OS-specific behavior, with some if-def statements for, do this if it's Windows, do this if it's Linux, do something else if it's BSD, and, I'm sure the list could go on from there. So I guess kind of the meta question is, what is the right approach to handle this? There's one PR that's open that's proposed reusing the distro flag that's already used in some of the other test cases to do things like, include or exclude tests based on the Linux distro. And so we've got a PR open that basically will skip these tests that I mentioned if the distro is set to, the field Windows. So that's kind of one approach. I think at this point, I'd like to turn over for questions.
So I can speak to the conformance process quickly, just to distinguish between what is the brainstorming discussion here and what is the process for conformance. The process for conformance is you can submit pull requests to change the conformance tests. That invalidates the list of sort of gold accepted conformance tests. And there is an approver process to submit that PR, and I think Clayton and Brian are in the owner's files there at this point. So that is the mechanics of changing the conformance tests. The second mechanism is when you submit conformance test results, there is a space to put in how you achieved those results so that others can reproduce them. And so there is a mechanism for someone to use reasonable judgment to say, yes, this makes sense to run these conformance tests. So I think it's useful to pre-flight and get guidance in this discussion. But as it goes forward, that is what's actually written into the terms and conditions of the conformance program. And finally, whatever the outcome, it may not be conformant Kubernetes, but that might be messaged with caveat, this is why, and we're working in this direction. And so I would suggest just going and reading some of the material on the conformance program itself. So all that said, I think the brainstorming and getting guidance here is a great direction to go, but I just wanted to make sure you had the context for how the conformance program works today.
Okay. Yeah, so I know a little bit about the high level, and I think that makes sense, but I guess, so I'll make sure that the question of, should this test be removed from conformance, we could take that to the other process. And I'll probably work with Lockie on that. So as far as the actual mechanics of how the test should work, did you want to cover that topic here or not?
I will open up to other discussion on that.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely the right forum to have that discussion.
I would say that 5 minutes, though, is probably not an adequate time to do that. So,
correct. And I also this is really tricky. I don't know how to deal with this because generally our rule is like if there's any skip of anything for any reason, it shouldn't be considered a conformance test because it can't work the same way everywhere. Some of these seem to have to do with the way environment variables work. Some of these have to do with the way file system permissions work. You could argue that if we could somehow abstract those away so it's using the appropriate OS-specific mechanism, that might be okay. But I don't know. I have to defer to other people for this.
Can I ask?
Sorry,
I'll put my hand up. And
maybe Quentin first.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, and I haven't been involved in detail in the conformance process, but there has been discussion about multiple layers of conformance, and that would seem to address this problem. So, if you want to run your program on any Kubernetes cluster, then it can only use the features that are part of the base level conformance. If you know you're running on a Windows Kubernetes cluster, then as long as it's conformant with the Windows suite, then you can run it on those ones, but not all Kubernetes clusters, and vice versa for Linux. Do we have that? Do we have a plan or actually a structure for that yet?
No, we've avoided that discussion as long as possible. The profiles or badges.
I mean, it sort of seems inevitable that we have to have that, and it seems like that's the way out of all these kinds of problems.
So we've got a queue of people to talk here. Doug had his hand up actually before you, Tim. Sorry.
Fine.
And then I'll hand off to you, Tim. And then it looks like somebody else in the room there. It looks like maybe Ken.
Yeah, I was just curious because Aaron was talking about, is it a matter of just running operating specific versions of Linux commands? Do we have I apologize, I haven't had a chance to fully read the PR yet, but does that talk about all the different types of variants in there? Like how many of them fall into that category Aaron mentioned versus something that you just can't abstract away? Do we have a good sense of how big the problem is for each of the categories?
I don't have the category list in front of me, but I could basically add a top level bullet point for each one. Like another one I just realized is there are conformance tests that also depend on TempFS, which is again a Linux specific one. Like I don't see why the same test case needs to run 2 different times to test the file system. So things like that.
Okay, that'd be helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, Tim.
A bunch of thoughts, but I'll try to keep it short. I'm very wary of trying to produce an abstraction across all of these things. I think that way lies madness. And also it would be such a huge set of API changes that I don't think it's a good starting point. I want to be careful that we don't conflate the idea of a profile, which has sort of functional and semantic meaning, with the architectural differences, which I think are pretty fundamental to the understanding. What I don't have in my head is a clear picture of where the architectural differences make semantic differences impossible, or make semantic convergence impossible. So the TempFS example is a great one. I'm assuming that Windows has an equivalent of the idea of a memory-backed file system. It just doesn't call TempFS. But if the answer is no, that is a much deeper question. That's a pretty important feature that a lot of people and other subsystems use. Can we make Kubernetes without such a thing?
So,
I don't want a bike shed on file system design here.
Yeah.
Okay, Ken had.
In a more general sense, maybe it's time to re-examine profiles, because so for instance, the workloads API, there's a open issue that people are saying we can't skip daemon set tests for non-disruptive updates in single node clusters. But that test doesn't make any sense for anything that's not single node. So there are definitely deployments and scenarios and profiles of Kubernetes where either we're going to have to skip tests under certain conditions, or we're going to have to say that, okay, a multi-node cluster is a different profile than a single node cluster. And removing those tests in general and saying, okay, those aren't conformance, does actually kind of change what it means to be Kubernetes. If you support daemon set and you don't support non-disruptive rolling updates, you're really out of conformance. So I don't want to get rid of that test. In the same way, I wouldn't want to get rid of TempFS testing for the reasons Tim just said, but maybe that doesn't make you completely non-conformant, and a profile would help.
I'm sorry, raising my hand.
To respond to a couple points, the intention and goal of the conformance program is to make some guarantees to end users about the portability of workloads and the consistency of the behavior of Kubernetes as a system. Where there are dependencies on implementation details and specific operating systems, that could just be a gap in the conformance tests today. And as long as the API surface remains consistent and workloads remain portable across them, that is in the spirit of the conformance program. I think the best step forward would be to make a proposal about how those tests could be modified to remain consistent to the intention of the test, which is to demonstrate the portability of workloads. Have that debate initially in the conformance SIG or working group, I guess it is, and come up with a proposal. And then I think that together, a unified message from that group we've considered this and this is the direction we think we should go. And that would become a proposal to SIG Architecture. Again, going back to more of the process and how to make the distinction.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Brendan, let's have you close out the discussion if that's all right, and then we need to move on to the next thing.
I always love having the last word. I have two thoughts about this. One is that I think that rather than getting down into the minutia, I think the right approach is to say, and this is sort of what was said in the previous thing, but to really focus on the principle of least surprise, right? Like if I am running a Windows container and I am specifying environment variables, the fact that they behave slightly differently than if I was running a Linux container and specifying environment variables, I don't think that's going to surprise me, right? Because like I understand that it's a Windows container, right? And I think that we should not have the goal be to like, it looks and feels exactly identical between the two systems because everybody understands that they're different. And so I think that we should really focus on effectively like, is this test minimizing surprise for the end user, or is the test just like validating a behavior that is implementation specific? That's point one, two. And then I think also in the spirit of making progress towards the GA, it may be that the most effective way to do this is to say, hey, you know what, we're going to mark hybrid clusters as conformant, and we're going to defer conformance for Windows-only clusters. And with the modifications that we will make to the tests are simply to add labels so that it forces the containers that are Linux specific onto Linux hosts. And I sort of split the problem into, can we produce a conformant hybrid cluster, and then can you later produce a conformant Windows-only cluster?
I think that sounds like it's purely additive, that the cluster itself passes the conformance tests in that way. That seems reasonable, and then adding additional functionality to it. I don't think there's any constraint on that I remember from the terms of service, so seems like a good path.
Can I ask one related but not exactly the same question?
If you make it quick.
Is there, or can there be a group put together to try to work through the places where the API exposes things that don't work on one architecture or the other, and try to come up with a proposal to reconcile that? I really hate having parts of the API that we say, yeah, you just don't use that on Windows because it doesn't work at all.
I think that is the conformance working group, right?
But it's more than just like the conformance test. It's actually, should we adapt the API? Like, should there eventually be a V2 API that splits the Linuxy parts from the generic-y parts?
So I actually think that hopefully that doesn't happen, right? Like hopefully the API doesn't need changes. It's just the behavior of the API may be different on the two different platforms. And that feels like it probably is okay, as long as it hews to the sort of principle of least surprise.
I would love to see that analysis done. Like, I'm surprised to learn that there isn't a tempfse sort of abstraction in Windows. Like, that's part of our API surface area. Is it the case that if somebody specifies a volume of medium memory that it just will never work on Windows, or is there a different implementation? Just to pick on one example. And we don't need to answer it here, but I would love to see somebody go through sort of piece by piece.
Yeah, secrets not getting written to disk is that seems actually kind of important.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. This is definitely good talk. A lot of good things here that we should queue up for future discussion. So, Daniel, do you want to hit feature gates real quick, and then Tim,
Yeah.
take it.
Hopefully we can keep this quick, everybody will just agree with me and we'll be done. No, the question has come up in a few different contexts, both for the server-side apply feature and a few other places. Jordan found one a couple days ago, which is what motivated me to add this to the meeting. The question is basically, does a feature gate prevent new usages of the feature, or does it also disable existing usages of the feature? So the scenario that we're thinking of is, I enable the feature gate, some of my cluster users use it, I discover some problem which may or may not be related to the usage of the feature. I want to disable the feature gate again. Those objects or resources or whatever it is that started using the feature, should they stop using the feature or should they continue using the feature? And my assertion is that it's actually safer to let the places that have started using the feature to continue to use the feature, because if you turn off the feature gate, you're doing this because there's some sort of problem. Something has gone wrong and you want to stabilize your cluster. That's probably the worst circumstance to exercise a new code path. Unfortunately, if you start, if you now have objects in the system that are using the feature, and you're going to go through some new untested code path if the feature gate goes off and you now want to change their behavior. So was that a reasonably clear summary of the question?
Yes.
Jacob, yes.
I would say one of the primary use cases of feature gates is to be able to roll back a feature you believe is bad to a previously known good path. So I'm unclear on why disabling it goes to an previously unused code path.
Well, because now we have to do the reverse migration, basically. Like for example, server-side apply, you've enabled the feature, somebody uses the new server-side mechanism. This transitions the annotation to a new data format that the server tracks. Now turning this off, does this mean like everybody who does this sort of one-way migration transition has to implement the reverse migration transition? Or this just stops working on this object? It's hard.
So we got a couple hands up. Jordan and then David Eads.
I think there are basically three states. There is using a feature gate to prevent data and code related to a new feature. And so that is, we're working on this. It's in alpha. It's not stable yet. We're not going to enable it in supported clusters. We're not going to allow data in, and we're not going to exercise any code related to this feature. And that's a very easy state to reason about, right? Nothing in the system is exercising this feature. Then there is the fully enabled state, right? We're going to let the fields be set. We're going to let controllers and code make use of those fields. And that's pretty easy to understand. And if you only roll forward, then that works. The issue is when you want to roll back and you want to turn off the code that's dealing with this feature because it's causing problems of some sort, but you still have data set in the system. And so that's this sort of third untested path, Jigo.
In other words, there's been a schema transition.
Yeah, so that's what I kind of would ask. What would you actually do to roll that back? Like if you change the object in the underlying storage and then you turn the gate off, you're going to implement logic that tries to mutate the object again under the hood and roll back the change you've made in the storage.
This is why I'm claiming that you'd be exercising a new code path at the worst possible time.
Yeah, like I don't know. I don't even know if that actually makes semantic sense or is in general possible.
David Eads.
So I think that if I were trying to use a feature gate and I decided I wanted to try to turn it off, and I set the feature gate to disabled, and the feature didn't turn off, I would be surprised that that was the result of my turning the feature gate back off. In terms of...
Would you also be surprised if you then got validation errors, or you had objects that could not be updated in unexpected ways?
So what we've done before with the feature gates that I've seen when we go and bring something in as alpha is that the storage for that thing will snip the field if the gate is disabled, which what it sounds like to me is I flip the feature gate back to off, run a storage migration, and then my data has that information cleared.
That doesn't always result in valid objects.
Yeah. Yeah. In particular, it doesn't result in the object that the user started out with before they turned on the feature.
I'm less concerned about preserving the exercise of this new feature because the feature gate got turned off. Like the goal of the administrator is to disable this code to make it stop. I am concerned about that field snipping leaving invalid objects, which it can do.
Okay.
The example is a union type where you have a new storage type like CSI, and you submit a pod or a PV or a PVC or PV that makes use of this CSI volume, and it comes in with a CSI volume, gets allowed in, and now you want to disable CSI because it destabilized something, and now you have invalid PVs that can't be updated or operated on.
All right, the example's helpful.
Okay, so Jago and then Tim, and then let's move on because we are running out of time quickly.
Okay, I'll just give feedback that as the operator of many clusters, my goal in using feature gates is to distinguish between the binary rollout and the feature enablement. And if that feature goes wrong, I would like to be able to roll that back. And it doesn't seem that either the way that we're proposing to turn off the feature or the binary re-rollout solves the problem. So I don't quite see the value proposed given my own use case. That's all.
Go ahead, Tim.
I will echo that it's not just feature gates that can introduce the situation that Jordan was describing about. Any new field that you introduce and then use and then roll back your API server to can introduce some semantic inconsistencies, and like all one of blocks are supposed to, well, in the sense of we invented this well after the first versions of the APIs were out, but we're supposed to have discriminators so that you can tell whether you have a discriminator set but no unknown value versus having an unknown thing. And I think it's just a reality of the roll forward, roll back. Ken and I had a discussion on this just yesterday about the evolution of versioned APIs and whether there's actually any sort of change at all that is actually completely forward and backwards compatible safe. And I think the answer is no, there's just none.
I mean, I wouldn't go that far. There are some, but microversioning is a non-goal, I guess. So,
I mean, if I can have a few seconds to respond to Jago, I think disabling new usages of a feature is actually super useful.
Don't let any more in.
Yeah, don't let the problem get any worse.
Okay.
So, we should move on. Aaron, you had your hand up. Is this something critical for this discussion?
It was just a super quick question. If we're changing the schema, why wouldn't we change the version to be able to identify these other objects? So we don't have to answer that now.
Not a quick question. The short answer is because we only have one digit in our versions.
Yes, no microversioning because we're
okay.
Tim, can you keep the next thing to say 7 minutes? I can be pretty quick with my update, and then we're going to have to boot the last item to the next week.
Yeah, no, we can boot mine to next week. My AI from last week was to survey all the open CAPs and to bring them to this group for some high-level review. There are 52 of them.
Yep. How'd that go?
I spent a good chunk of time this morning reading over just the subject and sort of looking at what some of them were. It was really hard to not get dragged into reviewing each of these things. Because these are really interesting ideas. Some of them have been open since like January and even earlier. So I would like to say just a couple things on this. We don't have time to survey all 50 here. We probably will never have time to survey all 50. What we really all need to do as sort of people who are interested in the architecture of the project, please go to the community repo, load up the open issues. There's only about 115 of them. And of those, half of them are either KEPs or proposals. I renamed or retitled a bunch of them to include the word KEP so that it was more obvious. Please go through and look at these things. And if we think we're not going to do them, please suggest that we close them. And if we are going to do them, please put your feedback in and get people unstuck. It's super valuable. There's a ton of really interesting proposals out there that I didn't even know were in flight. And the other question is like, what is blocking us from moving KEPs to a separate repo at this point? Anything?
Me.
It's incredibly painful to find all the KEPs.
It's we can blame Caleb.
Yeah, you can totally blame me.
Carry the water.
Me
I
not wanting
didn't
to.
want to throw names out, but that's the only things is the stuff that you signed up for last week, right?
Yeah, the thing that's blocking is the I don't want to do a bunch of gymnastics to slam in the tooling code as well as the content. So I'd like the content to be so I want to do get a bunch of KEPs merged. I want to then extract all the KEPs into their final home alongside the tooling once the tooling is ready for that.
So there's 50 plus open KEPs. It seems unlikely that you're going to get all 50 merged or even half of them.
Yeah, there's going to be like a drive. So I'm going to work with all the SIGs, and we're going to need to resolve at least half of them before moving them, because if we move them, then the PRs are just going to be like dangling pointers, which is not.
I strongly suggest that you just move there's no way.
Well,
we also encourage people to check in early as soon as they think it's a topic that the SIG's going to take up. There's no reason not to get it in.
Exactly, but like I don't want to have 50 PRs just dropped on the floor. That seems to be like a worst case scenario.
Well,
if we just move things now,
we clean up the junk ones. If people really care about them, they would reopen them against the new repository.
Anyway, I would like to say if there's any way that we can accelerate that and take things out of the blocking of that, it would be really beneficial to us in our ability to find and sort of pay attention to and help steer these ideas. And then the last point I'll note is of all the KEPs, there were at least a half dozen that are still in the proposals form. I feel like at this point we should just tell anybody who's writing proposal form proposals to stop that and write it as a KEP.
So the actual documentation on KEPs says they're not required.
I know.
So we need to. I think that's a precursor, and then we give them the ultimatum.
I would change that ASAP.
I would second that.
So one thing that I think we could have done a better job when we were designing the KEP process was to say, hey, there's going to be KEPs that are just specific to a SIG, and that SIG can own that process and own that thing sort of soup to nuts. And then there's KEPs that are sort of more impacting cross-project. Would that have helped if we had a clear delineation between SIG KEPs versus Kubernetes KEPs? Would that have helped to
a clear and distinct owner with continued unbroken commitment until KEPs were actually finished is what would have helped KEPs. I feel like they've been dropped on the floor and picked up time and time again.
Yes.
So, and it was never made clear.
Okay,
KEPs
I hear you, Aaron. Tim, would that have helped with your review, do you think?
Yes, although the preponderance of ones I looked at would not have fallen into that. I have personally told people who've written KEPs, I don't think you need a KEP for this. If this is entirely within your SIG, go do whatever your SIG needs.
Yeah, when they were first rolled out, they were always presented as cross-SIG things. If your impact is solely within SIG, don't touch KEPs.
Yeah, and I don't know that that's true. We need to.
So clearly we need some refinement here, but the single biggest thing that we can all do is to spend a half hour looking through the KEPs that are open and assigning yourself or tagging yourself on the ones that you intend to review and actually finding time over the next couple of weeks to review it.
Thank you so much, because it has been me and me alone doing all of this management now for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So this is one of those many very unglamorous, time-consuming, horrible things that as a chair, moving to the next topic, you get to do, and you get the benefit of being a chair, which means you get to do all this work. So I would love for all of us to step up and be chairs. I would love for every member of the SIG to be a chair, actually, so that we can take care of these things. And so I have a list of things in the chart, or in the agenda, that are sort of the housekeeping things that happen every single week. All of our project boards, there's 4 of them, need to be curated. All of the KEPs need to be reviewed. We need to proactively reach out to people with reviews that need to be done in the SIG and get them on the agenda. You need to make sure the agenda is filled in. All these things, you don't have to be an official chair to do any of this. just make sure that you leave a trail of breadcrumbs in terms of assigning keps to yourself or whatever it is that you need to do to let people know that you're doing it. But, you know, there's been some consternation about, you know, affiliation with who's what company or et cetera to be a chair. And it's like, honestly, just whoever does the job, I don't care if you're a cat that's an extremely talented cat that can do this, you'll be a chair. Like, let's spread this load out so it's not so onerous and make it really what it should be, which is a sort of servant leadership position. So please, everybody pitch in. It would be super helpful. Yes, musical chairs. Thanks, Jordan. We'll have a band. So that's kind of my 2 cents. This is a core value that we have as a project is chopping wood and carrying water. And really, like, the leadership roles in this SIG are 100% unglamorous, tons of time type things that need to be done. And I value that tremendously. And I know that the community does as well. So please, you know, if you're interested in leadership in any form, step in, do the work, and it will surface. So that's my PSA. And lastly, review the charter. And can I say one more thing about the charter too, is that it's very stripped down, and that's intentional. The steering committee has worked very hard to create a fungible set of values and practices across all the SIGs so that we're not dealing with a bunch of variations and make it hard for people to contribute and interact with SIGs. So there is a value placed on trying to follow existing norms. And so that the draft that's out there right now, the charter, is very much in alignment with that, and is something that will evolve over time, is not cast in stone. So let's get an initial charter in place, which is better than nothing, and then we'll improve on it over time. You know, let's use Kaizen in our own work. Let's do this the right way and just get stuff, you know, moving forward. Work?
I am not a fan of the way the standard charter stuff that we did in the steering committee around that chairs get to pick chairs. And so that's the one thing that I would love to see us for this SIG, which I think is a lot higher stakes than the other SIGs, I'd like to see us address before we merge. Because once it's merged, it's going to be the chairs that decide if it gets modified.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm picking chairs, like literally the next 5 people that go and do stuff, your chairs and your chair.
I hear what you say, but like, you know, we've already seen other SIGs where they've just picked chairs without consulting the rest of the SIG. And so
we won't do that.
This chair should not choose chairs, but that's the way that the docs are written right now. So I think that's something that I want to take up at the steering committee level in terms of the template docs. But I think, you know, short of that, you know, SIG architecture should at least model sort of fixing that particular loophole.
I would be supportive of taking this up at the steering level.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, like this isn't our job to fix, and there's enough steering committee members in this call right now that, you know, you all handle it and we'll respond, and we're always trying to lead by example.
The general point or the general version of Joe's point is the governance needs to have a self-correction mechanism. Like if it goes off the rails, something needs to fix it. But there's one additional point further beyond that you have to think, which is the self-correction mechanism also needs to not be an attack vector.
The existing language talks about a supermajority of members, but member is qualified as a chair, tech lead, or sub-project owner. If you turn that into just a member of the SIG, that'd be great, but then that means we have to figure out how do we establish SIG membership. But I think that's less of an attack vector. Supermajority, I don't know.
There's examples I can point to. I think there's a couple already where there was very little discussion before a new SIG chair was picked.
Yeah.
This is probably discussion with the steering committee, but I want to make sure that at least for this particular SIG, we recognize that that's something that.
Yes, we need to be careful about codifying it, but as far as me being a lead and my own personal integrity, that will not happen in the SIG, period.
I appreciate it, Jason.
Like, not happening. So, yeah. All right, thank you, everybody. We're at time. I sincerely appreciate everybody's participation. Great meeting. We'll kick the things forward to the next meeting and see you in a week. Take care, everybody.
Thanks all.